Plot twist, that lake is radioactive. If there's one thing that the Russians are good at, it's keeping secrets. For example, did you know that there are actually Russian troops in Ukraine right now? Who knew? They've done such a good job of keeping that thing under wraps. If super successfully hiding large troop movements isn't impressive enough though, just wait until you hear this shocker. For decades, the Russians hid entire cities. That sounded a lot more dramatic on paper. Closed cities in the Soviet Union were settlements that were deemed vital to state defense, and to prevent them from going kaboom, were literally erased from the map. To further confuse the capitalist pigs, each city would be assigned a postal box number from the nearest normal city to be used as its name. For example, the city of Snerzhinsk was known as Chelyabinsk 70 for over 30 years, which sounds cool and all, but I honestly don't know why they even bothered. Because to Americans, Russian city names just look like someone threw up the alphabet onto a page, so I think they would have been fine either way. Hello there, fellow Soviet. Hello, comrade. How many vowels are in your last name? One? That's way too many! Get 'em, boys! To prevent unrest, and maybe to compensate for the fact that they were forcing people to live in city-sized prisons, the Soviets made sure that conditions inside of closed cities were much better than the average Soviet could wish for. While your average Joe, Seth, was struggling on the collective farm, people inside closed cities had luxuries like, oh, I don't know, food. This all sounds very post-apocalyptic, so you might be thinking, these things can't really still exist, but that's where you're wrong! After the Soviet Union collapsed, many closed cities actually didn't want to open because then they would have to share all of their bananas and healthcare with the default skin Russians. Many other cities weren't given the choice and continue to be closed off to all foreigners. Hey there, I would like one ticket to Norilsk, please. No. What? Why? Is there something wrong? Well, you're just not quite Russian enough. Oh, okay. Alright, what about now? Back in the 1930s, the Soviets were digging around in the snow and happened to discover a bunch of metal just kinda hanging out underground. Naturally, this being the 1930s, Stalin decided that he might as well open a gulag there, and the city of Norilsk was born. After a couple thousand people died building it. With temperatures averaging around -10°C and frequently dropping to -50, Norilsk wouldn't exactly be where I'd want to retire, but it turns out that it's even worse than that. For one, there are no roads connecting the city to the rest of Russia. The only way in or out is by plane, which is super expensive, or by boat, which can only happen for a couple months of the year when the ocean isn't frozen. I would suggest setting your spawn point in Moscow and then killing yourself, but hey, what do I know? Also, remember all that metal stuck in the ground? Over half of the 175,000 people currently living in Norilsk are employed by the Russian megacorporation Norilsk Nickel, which operates massive pit mines that are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and 365 days a year. Prisoners were used to mine copper, nickel, and palladium here until 1979, but nowadays the workers actually get paid quite well. It's the only reason everyone hasn't moved away yet. To process all this metal, Norilsk Nickel has surrounded the city with smelters that pump poisonous gas into the air 24/7. No trees are able to grow naturally within a 19-mile radius of the city, and acid rain affects an area the size of Germany. The average person in Norilsk lives 10 years less than other Russians, and the nearby river has turned red. It's pretty bad, but don't just take my word for it, take it from someone who actually lives there. Thanks, Dimitri. Really insightful. It's 1945, and we should probably build one of those, huh? After World War II, the Soviets chose the city of Serov to be their main research center for their nuclear weapons program. Obviously, this was kind of a big deal, so the city was erased from all maps, renamed Arzamas-16, and kept super secret. This has been a really great night. We should do this again. I had a great time, too. I can pick you up next time. Where do you live? Well, I live in this little town called... Come on, guys! This is the third night in a row! Nowadays, you won't get shot for telling someone where you live, but don't expect to bring your date home anytime soon, because no one's allowed in the city without government permission. Talk about a mood killer. Everybody loves recycling, so when the Soviets found out that they could recycle old nuclear weapons to make new ones, boy did they go ballistic. Intercontinental ballistic, in fact. Right at the beginning of the Cold War, the Soviets built the Mayak nuclear plant to process plutonium for nuclear weapons. An entire city was soon built up around the facility with the help of 40,000 volunteers. You're probably sensing a pattern here. Izyorsk seemed like a pretty cool place for a while. People there had good food, good jobs, nice houses, and only some of them died from radiation poisoning. You see, the Mayak plant had ran out of storage room for their nuclear waste pretty early on, so instead of building more closets or whatever, they just started dumping all their nuclear sludge into the nearby lakes and rivers. Between 1945 and 1957, the equivalent of 2 Chernobyls were disposed of in this way. And then the whole thing blew up. The Kyshtym disaster occurred in 1957 when an uncooled vat of nuclear waste decided that it didn't like being trapped inside a steel tube and blew the whole storage facility sky high. No one was killed by the immediate explosion, but many would later die from the radiation. The Kyshtym disaster is considered to be the 3rd worst nuclear oopsie behind only Chernobyl and Fukushima. Although the facility stopped dumping its most toxic nuclear waste into the river after the disaster, they continue to this day to dump toxic materials into a nearby lake, which by 2014 was so radioactive that just standing by it for an hour would literally kill you, making it a popular tourist destination for people who had recently listened to Cardi B. It was unfortunately filled in just a few years ago. Well, that's enough Russia for today. If I don't post in the next 6 months, just assume I've been assassinated. A couple quick announcements. I've finished up my series on Vikings over on the Armchair Historian site, so check that out if you want. Additionally, while we're on the topic of Vikings, there's a whole channel dedicated to Viking history called, wait for it, The History of Vikings. I'd recommend you go check them out if you're interested, because they have some pretty cool stuff. They also have a podcast with people who know way more about history than me, so if you're a nerd, you might like it. Now, please excuse me while I cry in preparation for my finals.